I never wanted to get married. Hell, I never even wanted to leave Earth. But life is a funny way of dragging you into situations you never signed up for, and in my case, that situation involved an arranged marriage to a woman who wasn't even human. It all started with what the diplomats called an unfortunate misunderstanding. That's political talk for some idiot screwed up so badly that it nearly started an interstellar war. The idiot in question? Some cargo pilot named Riggs. The crime? Accidentally referring to a high-ranking Thalvar diplomat as a cranky old lizard during a tense trade negotiation. To be fair, Riggs didn't know the diplomat spoke English. He also didn't know that in Thalvar culture, referring to someone's age in a derogatory way was just about the worst insult imaginable. Insulting a noble Thalvar's age was like spitting on their ancestors, burning their family crest, and challenging them to a duel all at once. The Thalvar were a proud, warlike species. Unlike humans, who had only recently stumbled into the galactic scene, wide-eyed and full of bravado, the Thalvar had been expanding their empire for millennia. They didn't do second chances. If a lesser species insulted them, they wiped them out. That was their way. And unfortunately, humanity was still firmly classified as a lesser species. So, when the insult reached the ears of the noble houses, the ruling council convened immediately. The response was clear. Humanity had two options: a formal war, which humanity would lose spectacularly; a blood price. Now, when I first heard the term blood price, I assumed it meant something violent. A ritual execution, maybe trial by combat. Something appropriately brutal for a warrior culture. I was wrong. Apparently, in Thalvar culture, the preferred form of restitution for a grave insult was to bind the offending party's bloodline to their own. A marriage. A contract that would symbolically make humanity part of the Thalvar lineage, ensuring that future insults would reflect back on them as well. And lucky me, I just happened to be the perfect candidate. Why? Because I had just enough combat experience to be respectable in their eyes, but not so much power or influence that losing me would destabilize anything politically. I was, as one of the human ambassadors so eloquently put it, expendable but not embarrassing. They needed a human representative, someone they could throw into this mess as a peace offering, and I fit the bill. So, just like that, I was chosen. No appeals. No negotiations. I was told, not asked, that I was to marry a Thalvar noblewoman, Lady Valeth of House Zyrith, one of the most powerful houses in the Empire. The contract was signed, the preparations were made, and within 2 weeks, I was put on a ship and sent straight into the heart of the Empire, where my new life awaited. I spent most of the trip staring at the ceiling of my quarters, trying to wrap my head around how my life had gone from scraping by as a mercenary to alien noble's husband in the span of a month. I wasn't special. I wasn't some grand hero of humanity. I was just a guy who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now I was about to be legally bound to a woman I had never met, in a culture I barely understood, with no way out. The universe had a sick sense of humor. Arrival at the Zyrith estate. The Thalvar homeworld was nothing like Earth. The air was thinner, the sky was a deep violet, and the sun burned red on the horizon. Towering spires of black stone stretched into the sky, carved with intricate symbols that pulsed faintly in the twilight. I arrived at the Zyrith estate under heavy guard, not because they thought I was dangerous, but because this entire arrangement was highly controversial among the noble class. The guards escorted me through the massive entrance hall, where cold, silver-tinted light reflected off obsidian pillars. The walls were covered in elaborate tapestries, each depicting some great battle or conquest. And standing at the center of it all was her, Lady Valeth, my new wife. She was tall, regal, and utterly unreadable. Her presence radiated power, the kind of authority that made it clear she was used to command. The first words she ever spoke to me were simple. "You are smaller than I expected." "Great start." Thanks," I said awkwardly. I was expecting, I don't know, a ceremony or something. She tilted her head slightly. "The contract is already signed. Ceremonies are for those who choose marriage. You and I have no need for pretense." Ah, so that was how it was going to be. I wasn't her husband. I was a duty, a political pawn. Fine by me. I hadn't been planning on playing the loving spouse anyway. Still, something about her gaze unsettled me. It wasn't anger or even disappointment. It was calculation. Like she was already measuring my worth, deciding exactly how much effort I was worth investing in. Before I could say anything else, another figure entered the hall. And that was when I met Cilia, the stepdaughter I didn't expect. I knew Valeth had a daughter. The contract had mentioned it in passing. But what I didn't expect was just how close we were in age. Cilia was only 10 years younger than me, which made her what? My stepdaughter now? That was a mental hurdle I wasn't ready to jump just yet. She studied me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not hostility, not disinterest, something in between. So, she said finally, "This is the human they sent?" Her voice had an edge to it, like she was testing me. "Yeah," I replied, folding my arms. "Not what you were expecting?" She tilted her head, her gaze flickering over me, assessing. "I expected someone older, someone with more scars." "Well, that was ominous. Sorry to disappoint," I said dryly. A slow, almost amused smile curled her lips. "I didn't say I was disappointed." Okay, that was when I realized something. This wasn't just awkward. This was going to be a problem. The weight of duty. The rest of the night was a blur. Formal introductions. Explanations of my new role. Endless discussions of Thalvar customs and expectations. But beneath all of it, I could feel it. An unspoken tension settling over the household. Valeth treated me like a political tool. Cilia watched me with an interest I couldn't decipher. And I was trapped in a marriage I hadn't chosen, in a world that wasn't mine, with no idea what the hell I was supposed to do next. As I lay in bed that night, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, one thought echoed in my mind. What the hell have I gotten myself into? The first morning in my new home was awkward. Scratch that awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. I woke up to the sound of deep, resonant chimes vibrating through the walls, like someone had tuned a cathedral bell to a frequency specifically designed to rattle my bones. It took me a solid 5 seconds to remember where the hell I was. Oh, right. Alienopia. Arranged marriage. Political hostage/diplomatic peace offering. Fantastic. I groaned and sat up, rubbing my face. The room they'd given me was massive, easily twice the size of any apartment I'd ever lived in. The bed alone was absurd, big enough to fit 4 people comfortably, covered in dark silken sheets that felt expensive. The walls were carved from the same black stone as the rest of the estate, and alien symbols glowed faintly along the edges, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. Thalvar architecture had a strange way of making everything feel ancient and high-tech at the same time. I was still taking it all in when the door slid open without so much as a knock. I jumped, nearly falling out of bed. And there she was, Cilia, standing in my doorway like she owned the place, arms folded, her weight shifted lazily to one side. She didn't say anything right away, just looked at me. And yeah, I was suddenly very aware that I was shirtless. I grabbed the nearest blanket and pulled it over myself. Ever heard of knocking? Her lips twitched. This is my home, human. I go where I please. Great. Just great. She took a few steps inside, her boots clicking softly against the floor. Unlike her mother, who carried herself with cold precision, Cilia had a more casual kind of confidence. Relaxed, but with an edge underneath, like a blade hidden in silk. "Breakfast is in the grand hall," she said. "If you don't want to starve, you should get moving." "Right," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "I'll be there." She didn't move. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, watching me with a look I couldn't quite place. "You don't look like a warrior," she said after a moment. I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You. The one they sent to be my mother's mate." She said the word with the barest hint of amusement. I expected somewhat different. I sighed, swinging my legs over the bed. "Yeah, well, sorry to disappoint." That same small, knowing smile played at the edges of her lips. I didn't say I was disappointed. And just like that, she turned and strode out of the room, leaving me sitting there, suddenly feeling very awake. The Thalvar breakfast experience. I barely had time to dress myself, and run a hand through my hair before heading to the grand hall. The place was enormous, lined with towering black pillars, the ceiling stretching so high it disappeared into shadows. A massive table sat at the center, covered in food that I barely recognized. Sliced meats that shimmered under the light, dark purple fruits that looked like something out of a sci-fi horror movie, and some kind of thick, steaming beverage that smelled way too strong to be coffee. Valeth was already seated at the head of the table, looking every bit the untouchable noblewoman she was. She barely acknowledged me as I sat down, which suited me just fine. Cilia, however, was sitting just a few seats away, and unlike her mother, she had plenty of attention to spare. She watched me as I cautiously examined the food, probably waiting to see if I'd embarrass myself. I picked up a piece of the meat, sniffed it, then took a bite. It was surprisingly good. A little salty, a little smoky, but not bad. Cilia raised an eyebrow. "You're braver than I thought." I swallowed. "Why? What did I just eat?" Her smirk widened. "You don't want to know." Valeth finally spoke, her voice smooth and controlled. "You will adapt." I glanced at her. To the food? To everything. I resisted the urge to sigh. If she wanted to be cryptic, fine. I had bigger things to worry about, like the fact that her daughter was still watching me with that unreadable expression. "So," Cilia said, propping her chin on one hand, "what exactly are you supposed to do now?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" She gestured vaguely. "You're here. You've been married off to my mother. But you have no real power, no title, and no say in anything that actually matters. So what is your role exactly?" She had a point. I had no idea what the hell I was supposed to do here. I wasn't a politician. I wasn't a noble. I wasn't even a respected warrior in their eyes. I was just here. Valeth, as usual, had an answer before I did. "He will learn our ways," she said, setting down her cup. "He will integrate." Cilia snorted softly, clearly amused by the idea. "You sight. So, basically, I have to prove I'm not useless." "That would be wise," Valeth said simply. "Fantastic. No pressure. Adjusting to life among the Thalvar." The days that followed were strange. My time was split between training sessions because apparently I was expected to hold my own in combat if I wanted to earn any respect, and long, grueling lessons on Thalvar culture. Cilia, of course, found endless entertainment in watching me struggle. "You move like a civilian," she observed one afternoon, leaning against the railing of the training yard as I got my ass handed to me by a Thalvar combat instructor. "That's because I am a civilian," I grumbled, wiping sweat from my brow. She grinned. "Then you'd better learn quickly, husband." I groaned. "Can we not call me that?" "But it's what you are," she said, tilting her head. "Isn't it strange? You're bound to my mother, yet you act like none of this is real." I met her gaze. "Because it doesn't feel real." Cilia was silent for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, she sighed and pushed off the railing. "Come on, human. You're embarrassing yourself. Let me show you how it's done." And just like that, she grabbed a practice weapon and stepped into the ring with me. I barely had time to react before she struck, moving with speed and precision that made it very clear she was leagues above me. I blocked the first hit. Barely. The second one knocked me flat on my ass. She smirked down at me. "Told you." I groaned. Yeah. You're terrifying." Message received. She extended a hand. I hesitated for a second before taking it. As she pulled me to my feet, I caught something in her expression, something just beneath the surface. Amusement, yes, but also curiosity. And that was when I realized that whatever this was between us, whatever this strange dynamic was, it wasn't going away anytime soon. And that might just be a problem. I had just started to feel like I was getting a handle on my new life. That, of course, meant the universe was about to throw something at me I wasn't remotely prepared for. It had been a few weeks since my arrival at the Zyrith estate. In that time, I developed a sort of routine. Mornings were spent in combat training, afternoons in tedious lessons about Thalvar customs, and evenings either suffering through stiff, formal dinners with Valeth or dodging Cilia's increasingly sharp-edged teasing. I was getting used to it, or so I thought. It turned out that adapting to life among the Thalvar was one thing. Dealing with Cilia was another beast entirely. I should have seen the warning signs, the lingering glances, the way our conversations lasted just a little too long, the way she seemed to find excuses to be near me, watching, assessing, testing my reactions. But I had been too distracted, too focused on surviving, on figuring out my place in all this, to notice the trap I was walking into. That changed the night I caught her watching me. Training until exhaustion. That day, training had been brutal. The Thalvar had no patience for weakness, and my instructor, an old war veteran named Jekker, made that very clear. "You're too slow, human," he growled, circling me like a predator as I gasped for breath. A warrior does not hesitate. Hesitation is death. Yeah, well, I panted, wiping sweat from my brow. "I'm trying not to die here." Jekker snorted. Pathetic. Then, without warning, he lunged. I barely managed to block the strike, stumbling back as the training blade slammed into mine. He was faster than someone his age had any right to be. Stronger too. Every time I thought I had an opening, he shut it down instantly, countering with a speed that made my muscles burn. By the time he finally relented, I was drenched in sweat and barely standing. "Enough for today," he declared. "Clean yourself up. You reek of failure." "Gee, thanks," I muttered, dragging myself toward the exit. As I stumbled out of the training yard, I felt a familiar presence. Cilia. She was leaning against one of the stone pillars, watching with that same unreadable expression. "You lasted longer today," she observed. "Yeah," I muttered. "Still got my ass kicked, though." She shrugged. "That's to be expected. You're human." "Wow. Encouraging." She smirked. "I could tell you that you're improving. That soon, you'll be able to hold your own." "But that would be a lie." I rolled my eyes. "You really know how to boost a guy's confidence, you know that?" She just chuckled, falling in a step beside me as I made my way back toward my quarters. I had gotten used to this, to the way she always seemed to be around, to the way she spoke to me differently than she spoke to anyone else. But I had no idea what was coming next. The moment everything changed. After training, I headed straight for my quarters. I was exhausted, sore, and all I wanted was a shower and some fresh clothes. The Zyrith estate had these sleek, high-tech changing rooms attached to each personal suite. They were spacious, lined with metallic panels that emitted a soft glow, and the showers operated with some fancy water vapor system that supposedly cleansed the body better than normal water. It felt weird at first, but I'd gotten used to it. I stripped off my sweat-soaked shirt, tossing it onto a nearby bench. My muscles ached from training, and I rolled my shoulders, wincing slightly as I rotated my arm. And that was when I felt it, that strange, unmistakable sensation of being watched. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My instincts, honed by years of living in dangerous places, screamed at me. Slowly, very slowly, I turned my head, and there she was, Cilia, standing in the doorway, half hidden by the frame. Her gaze was fixed on me, her expression unreadable. But it wasn't just curiosity. It was something else, something sharper, something deliberate. For a few long seconds, neither of us moved. My brain short-circuited. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head, none of them making sense. Was this normal in Thalvar culture? Did she just not care about personal space? Or was this? No, no way. That wasn't possible, right? I started, but my voice came out weirdly strained. "Cilia?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying me like she was waiting for something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "You're different from what I expected." That was not the response I was prepared for. I grabbed the nearest thing, a towel, and hastily wrapped it around my waist. "Okay, what the hell?" She blinked, as if only now realizing that this situation might be questionable. Then, to my utter disbelief, she smirked. "Relax, human," she said smoothly. "It's not as if I haven't seen a male body before." "That is not the point," I sputtered. "Then what is the point?" she countered, stepping a little further into the room. "Why does this make you uncomfortable?" I stared at her. "Are you serious right now?" She arched a brow. "Is this a human thing? Modesty? Oh, come on." Yes. Obviously, this is very much a human thing." I gestured wildly. "You don't just watch people change. That's not normal." Cilia considered this for a moment. Then, to my horror, she took another step forward. My survival instinct screamed at me to do something, but my body was frozen in place, trapped in some bizarre mix of shock, confusion, and holy crap. What is happening right now? Celia studied me, her eyes flickering with something I really didn't want to decipher. "You're a very strange human," she murmured. And then, just like that, she turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, towel clutched in a death grip. What the hell? Aftermath. I didn't move for a solid minute. My brain was still trying to reboot itself, trying to process what just happened. Did she do that on purpose? Was she messing with me? Was this some weird Thalvar cultural test? Or was it something else? I groaned, running a hand through my hair. This was bad. I've been trying, really trying, to keep things simple, to focus on survival, on adapting to my new life. But Celia wasn't making that easy. She was playing a game. That much was clear. The real question was, what were the rules? And more importantly, did I even want to find out? Avoiding Celia became my new full-time job. I wasn't proud of it, but after the changing room incident, I had no choice. Something had shifted between us, something I didn't quite understand, and I sure as hell didn't know how to handle it. Maybe it had been a joke to her, maybe not, but the way she had looked at me, that calm, assessing gaze like she had been waiting for me to react, had shaken me more than I cared to admit. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. Not literally. That would have been obvious. But I made sure our paths never crossed unless absolutely necessary. I adjusted my training schedule, so I arrived before she usually did. I ate at different times. I took the long way around the estate just to avoid the corridors I knew she frequented. It wasn't exactly mature, but it was safe. Or so I thought. Celia apparently had other ideas. The games begin. At first, she seemed amused. The first time she caught me going out of my way to avoid her, she just smirked. The second time, she raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. The third time, that's when I knew I was in trouble. It was during one of my afternoon strategy lessons, where I was supposed to be learning the intricacies of Thalvar military tactics. I was seated in the study hall, poring over holographic battle maps, when I felt that strange, lingering sensation of being watched. I glanced up. Celia was standing near the doorway, arms crossed, a knowing look in her eyes. I pretended not to notice and turned back to my studies. A minute passed, then another. She didn't leave. Instead, she strolled inside, taking her time, moving with the kind of confidence that made it very clear she knew exactly what she was doing. I tensed. She didn't say a word. She just walked behind me, slowly, deliberately, her presence looming just over my shoulder. I refused to look at her. She leaned down just slightly. "You're avoiding me, human." I forced myself to remain calm. "I've been busy." She let out a soft hum. "Liar." I exhaled through my nose, gripping the table a little too hard. "Did you need something, Celia?" She tilted her head, studying me. "Not particularly. Just curious." "About what?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she circled around the table and leaned against the edge of it, her eyes locked onto mine. "You confuse me," she admitted. I blinked. "I confuse you?" She nodded. "Most men, especially human men, react very differently to me." I swallowed. "Yeah, well, I'm not most men." Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "That much is obvious." For a moment, there was silence. A heavy, unspoken tension settled between us, one I really didn't want to analyze. Then, finally, I pushed back my chair and stood. "If you're done analyzing me," I said, "I need to get back to studying." Her gaze flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Then, to my relief, she nodded. "As you wish, husband." And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, pretending I wasn't completely rattled. Damn it. This was not going to be easy. A conversation I couldn't avoid. That night, I found myself on the balcony, staring out at the alien sky, trying to process everything. The Thalvar homeworld was beautiful in its own way. The stars here burned different, casting the sky in deep shades of violet and crimson. A massive gas giant loomed on the horizon, bathing the landscape in a soft, eerie glow. I leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. I needed a plan. I couldn't keep avoiding Celia forever. That much was obvious. But I also couldn't afford to get dragged into whatever game she was playing. I was still thinking it over when I heard footsteps behind me. I already knew who it was. You're really struggling with this, aren't you? Celia's voice was quieter this time, lacking its usual teasing edge. I sighed, but didn't look at her. Struggling with what? You tell me. I shook my head. Celia, I don't know what you want from me. She was silent for a moment. Then, neither do I. That made me turn. She was leaning against the railing beside me, her gaze distant, thoughtful. I don't usually have to guess what people are thinking, she admitted. It's frustrating. I let out a dry laugh. Welcome to my life. She glanced at me. Is it really that complicated? I met her gaze. Yes. She studied me for a long moment. Then, finally, she sighed and pushed off the railing. I won't bother you tonight then, she murmured. And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, more confused than ever. Damn it. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Drawing the line. The next morning I made a decision. It was time to set boundaries. I found Celia in the training yard, watching a group of Thalvar soldiers sparring. She turned as I approached, raising an eyebrow. Finally stop running? She teased. I took a deep breath. We need to talk. She smirked. That's serious? Yes. That seemed to catch her attention. She folded her arms, waiting. I met her gaze. Whatever this is, whatever game you're playing, it needs to stop. For the first time, her expression shifted. The amusement in her eyes dimmed slightly, replaced by something more unreadable. A game? She repeated. Yes, I said firmly. The teasing. The mind games. Whatever it is you're trying to do, I can't play along. She was silent for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, she let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. You really think this is a game to me? I hesitated. Isn't it? She shook her head. You don't understand, do you? Then explain it to me. She exhaled slowly. I was raised in a world where duty comes before everything, where emotions are secondary, where alliances are forged through strength, not sentiment. And then, you show up. This human, bound to my mother through a contract neither of you chose, pretending none of it matters. I clenched my jaw. I never said it didn't matter. Then why do you act like it? She asked, stepping closer. Why do you pretend you don't feel anything? I inhaled sharply. Because I can't afford to. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. Celia held my gaze for a long time. Then, finally, she nodded. All right, she said softly. Lines in the sand. I understand. And just like that, she turned and walked away. I should have felt relieved. But instead, as I stood there watching her disappear into the distance, all I felt was uneasy. Because somehow I knew deep down this wasn't over. Not even close. I thought I had things under control. That was my first mistake. The second was believing that setting boundaries would actually change anything. It had been a week since my conversation with Celia in the training yard. The one where I laid everything out, told her that whatever game she was playing needed to stop. I had expected some kind of pushback, maybe a sarcastic remark, maybe another attempt to get under my skin. But to my surprise, she had backed off. Sort of. She didn't hover around me as much. She stopped teasing me quite as often. The pointed stares, the smirks, the comments that made my pulse spike. They all faded. And yet, somehow, it didn't make things easier. If anything, it made them worse. Because now, instead of her obvious challenges, I was left with something far more dangerous. Silence. An absence. The space she used to occupy still felt full. And it was making me realize something I really didn't want to acknowledge. I missed it. I missed her. The weight of silence. The thing about Celia was that she had a way of filling up a room, even when she wasn't in it. I caught myself expecting her to be there when I walked into the training yard, but she wasn't. I found myself looking for her at mealtimes, only to see her sitting further away than usual, engaged in quiet conversations with other nobles. It was subtle, but it was there. A careful kind of distance, and I hated that it bothered me. It shouldn't have. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? To make things simple, to keep our situation from becoming complicated. But now, it was like she had taken a step back, waiting to see what I would do. And that was somehow worse. A storm on the horizon. The breaking point came 3 days later. The weather had turned that evening. Storm clouds rolling in over the Zyrith estate, streaks of violet lightning crackling across the sky. The Thalvar homeworld didn't have rain like Earth did, but the electric storms here were something else. The energy in the air made my skin tingle, a low hum reverberating through the stone walls. I was in my quarters, trying to focus on one of my assigned readings, some long-winded document about Thalvar political structures, when I heard it. A knock. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Celia stood there, her expression unreadable. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, "Can I come in?" Her voice was quieter than usual. I hesitated, not because I didn't want her to, but because I knew what it meant. Letting her in meant inviting whatever this was to happen. But she was already here, wasn't she? Already in my head, already there in ways I didn't want to think about too much. So I stepped aside. She entered without a word, her movements slower than usual, almost careful. I closed the door behind her. For a few moments, we stood there, the hum of the storm outside filling the silence. Then, finally, she spoke. "You've been avoiding me." I sighed. "I thought you were avoiding me." She tilted her head slightly, studying me. "I was giving you space. You seemed to think you needed it." "I did," I admitted. "You do." "Then why do you look miserable?" I let out a dry laugh, running a hand through my hair. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Get in my head." A small smirk flickered across her lips, but it faded almost instantly. "I wasn't trying to," she murmured. "Not this time." Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. I had been so busy trying to distance myself, trying to pretend this wasn't happening, that I hadn't seen it. She wasn't just playing games anymore. She was hurt. And for some reason, that mattered more than it should have. The crack in the wall. I exhaled slowly, leaning back against the wall. "Celia," I hesitated, then shook my head. "This isn't a good idea." She didn't move. Didn't even blink. "Why?" "You know why." "Say it." I clenched my jaw. "Because this is complicated." A long silence stretched between us. Then, softly, "Everything in my life is complicated," she murmured. "You're the only thing that isn't." That hit harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to argue, to say something, anything, but before I could, she stepped closer. Not enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence, the space between us shrinking with every second. "Tell me to leave," she said quietly. I swallowed. I should have. I should have told her to turn around, to walk away before we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I met her gaze, and for the first time, I let myself really look at her. Not as Valith's daughter. Not as my stepdaughter by forced marriage. Just as Celia. The sharp wit, the quiet intelligence, the way she moved through the world like she owned it. But beneath all of that, something real. Something human, even if she wasn't. Something I wanted. Damn it all. Before I could talk myself out of it, before I could think, she moved. And so did I. The kiss. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't careful. It was heat and tension and all the things we hadn't said crashing together at once. Her hands found my face, my fingers tangled in her hair, and for a moment, just a moment, the rest of the universe didn't matter. Not the contract. Not Valith. Not the politics that had forced us into each other's lives. None of it. Just this. Just us. The storm outside crackled, lightning flashing through the window, casting shadows against the walls. When we finally pulled apart, her breath was warm against my lips. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to, because we both knew. There was no going back. This had happened, and whatever came next, we would have to face it together. I barely slept that night, not because of regret. If anything, regret was the one thing missing from the storm of emotions tearing through my head. The moment with Celia still lingered, seared into my mind like an electric charge that hadn't yet faded. The taste of it, the weight of it, the quiet inevitability of it. There had been no hesitation. No second guessing. Just a collision of everything we'd been dancing around for weeks. Everything we had ignored or denied or buried under forced conversations and uneasy silence. Now it was real, and there was no pretending otherwise. The morning after, I had hoped, stupidly, that I might be able to avoid her the next morning. That maybe she would need time to process what had happened, just like I did. No such luck. The moment I stepped into the grand hall for breakfast, she was already there, waiting. Her expression was unreadable, as composed as ever, but her eyes gave her away. She knew. She was waiting. For me to speak first. For me to define what last night had been. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then forced myself to move. I sat down across from her, carefully, deliberately, as if we were just two people having a normal meal, as if my world hadn't cracked open less than 12 hours ago. Celia didn't break the silence right away. Instead, she lifted her cup, took a slow sip of that strange, dark Thalvar beverage, and watched me over the rim. Waiting. The tension stretched unspoken across the length of the table. I exhaled. So. One perfect brow arched. So. I forced myself to meet her gaze. Are we going to talk about it? She set her cup down, fingers tapping once against the polished surface of the table. You're the one who wanted to draw a line, she said evenly. Are you here to redraw it? Damn it. I ran a hand down my face, already knowing this wasn't going to be easy. Celia, you know what this means? She tilted her head slightly. I know what it means to you. That caught me off guard. What's that supposed to mean? She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. You think this is about rules, about consequences. You're so focused on what shouldn't happen that you refuse to ask yourself what you want. I opened my mouth, closed it, because that was the problem, wasn't it? I knew what I wanted, but wanting something and acting on it were two very different things. I pushed back my chair, standing. I need to think. Celia didn't stop me. She just watched me go. The mother of all problems. I spent most of the day in the training yard, trying and failing to beat the confusion out of my system. I threw myself into the drills, pushing my body harder than usual, trying to quiet the storm in my head with sheer exhaustion. It didn't work, because the moment I let my guard down, even for a second, my mind drifted back to her. To the way she had looked at me, to the way I had let it happen, and worse, to the fact that if given the choice, I would do it again. That was the part that scared me. That was the part that kept me from thinking too hard about what happened next. And then, of course, things got worse. Because just as I was finishing up training, wiping sweat from my brow, I looked up and saw Valeth watching me. I stiffened instantly. She rarely came to the training yard. Unlike Celia, who had a habit of showing up just to mess with me, Valeth was always deliberate. If she was here, it was for a reason. I straightened, lowering my training blade. Lady Valeth. She inclined her head slightly in greeting. Walk with me. I hesitated for only a second before nodding. We left the training yard, moving down one of the estate's stone walkways. The sky above was darkening, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, my daughter is restless, Valeth said finally. I kept my expression carefully neutral. She's sharp, observant. She is also stubborn. I swallowed. I assume you brought me here to talk about her. Valeth stopped walking. Then, slowly, she turned to face me. You have caught her attention, she said simply. I didn't move, didn't breathe, because suddenly, I wasn't sure if I was walking into a conversation or an execution. Valeth studied me, her gaze sharp, assessing. I am not blind, she continued, nor am I naive. Celia is young, and you are new, different. A pause. But she is also a Zyrith. I nodded carefully. I understand. She tilted her head. Do you? I exhaled. I don't want to cause problems, Lady Valeth. And yet, here we are. A tense silence. Then, to my surprise, something shifted in her gaze. For the first time, she almost looked amused. I will not tell you what to do, she said finally. But understand this, Celia is not a child. And she is not a fool. Whatever happens next, she will decide for herself. I nodded slowly. She turned to leave. Then, just before she disappeared down the walkway, she is her mother's daughter, after all, And just like that, she was gone. The choice. By the time I returned to my quarters that night, my head was spinning. Valith's words had only confirmed what I already knew. I had a choice to make. Avoid it. Pretend nothing had happened. Keep the distance between us, no matter how much it killed me. Or, I exhaled sharply. The choice had already been made, hadn't it? I just hadn't admitted it yet. A knock at the door made me freeze. I already knew who it was. I took a breath, opened it. Celia stood there, silhouetted by the dim hallway light. Neither of us spoke. Then, after a long moment, she stepped inside, and I let her. The door slid shut behind us. There was no more space between us, no more lines to draw, no more running, just the quiet, heavy certainty of something real. And whatever came next, we would face it together.